Well, hello, welcome Dr. Megan C. Hayes to the Writing with Purpose podcast. It's very exciting to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
Great. So, Megan, we met at the Barcelona Journal Festival in November in 2024. And this is one of the episodes of a seven-part journaling series all about journaling and writing for well-being. So I'm looking forward to delving into that with you. But my first interaction with you was I downloaded The Joy of Writing Things Down on Audible, which was part of a master's degree that I was doing in creative writing and well-being. And I remember your book so vividly because we were having the kitchen done at the time. And I had an hour here and there where I was listening to your book, and I thought you really did give some insight into how people could find joy in words in all sorts of different places. So it's quite eye-opening. So yeah, thank you for publishing that book.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure to share the simple ways that we can incorporate writing into our life because I think sometimes like many things, it can kind of get overcomplicated and people feel that they have to do it in a certain way or there's a lot of superficial stuff to it. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to put that book together.
So, yeah, and I haven't introduced you properly. So, you are a researcher, a writer, and a mentor, and a relentless optimist, which I love that because optimism was my chosen word for 2005. And from your website, I love what you'd written about you're fascinated with words and equally fascinated with how words create well-being. And I certainly believe that words form a major part of us in creating a life that we love. So if you would please just give us a little whistle stop account of how you came to do what you do today, that would be fabulous.
Hmm. Well, something I often talk about is just growing up that my mother experienced bipolar episodes. And so I often attribute my fascination with well-being to just watching my mum, really, because she, you know, struggled a lot with her mental health and yet was overall able to really carve out a wonderful, happy life for herself and very committed to well-being practices like yoga. And she also writes a lot and reads a lot. So I think I watched her as a young girl and just became, yeah, just really fascinated with what it means to live well, especially, for example, if you're somebody who is struggling with your mental health, like so many people are in the modern
Yeah.
world. At the same time, I always loved creative writing. So I was writing stories and making things up, from all my life. There's no memory that I have that it didn't include me thinking I was going to be writing. So
Mm.
it's really been an anchor for me my whole life. So my initial degree when I went to university was in creative writing and English literature. And yeah, I just had fun kind of crafting my own stories, etc. But I still had this overarching interest in well-being. And I think because of the context in which I grew up with my mum struggling a lot, um, traditional psychology didn't necessarily appeal to me as something to study. I almost felt like I'd had a front row seat to, the dark stuff, if you like. But then as I was coming to the end of my undergrad degree, I sort of discovered, if you like, this field of positive psychology and the idea that there was a formalized study of creativity, of resilience, of what goes right with humans, what's best in us, and how we can kind of do more with that and work with what's going well. So that took me to do my master's degree at University of East London in applied positive psychology. And I was lucky to be able to take that track, like not having done psychology for my undergrad. And then it was in that academic journey that I discovered Pennebaker's expressive writing paradigm and all the really interesting kind of quantitative science that's behind emotional expression in writing. And so it's kind of, there was all these synergies occurring and things like snapping together for me in my mind. And then I went back to the humanities for my PhD, because my PhD is in English, but brought a lot of that theory from pos psych with me to look at, yeah, creative writing and what makes us well, what prompts creative writers, particularly in my PhD study, to write, given that a lot of artists and creative writers, suffer a lot for their art, or, it doesn't make a lot of money. You might work on a novel for 10 years, 20 years with no guarantee that you're going to get it published. So I'm just, yeah, really intrigued by what it is that keeps people writing. Why do we want to put our life stories into words and share them with others? And just fundamentally that side of human beings as storytelling beings. It's very unique, in the animal kingdom that we verbalize and tell stories around the campfire kind of thing. Um, And then from there, yeah, I've gone into teaching and publishing some of my research. And I like to say that everything I do revolves around words in some way or another. So whether it's like leading people with journaling exercises, journaling workshops, publishing my books on journaling, doing my own creative writing. I teach creative writing for a university. So anything to do with words and well-being, I'm there.
And you can see how passionate you are about it as well by the way that you talk. Do you, I have to ask you, you mentioned a lot about the academic side of things and the research and the books that I'm familiar with from yourself or kind of down that path. But do you have any aspirations to publish anything creative, like a fiction novel?
I have been working on fiction my whole life. I haven't managed to get anything published. I've come quite close, but my next book is coming out next year, if all goes well, and it's a memoir. So I'm working in the realm. That's mainly what I've ended up teaching academically is like narrative nonfiction, so life
Hmm.
writing of different kinds. Mainly because my PhD looked a lot at writing and identity and how the self comes into writing and trauma. And I've dabbled here and there writing little bits of memoir over the years, and it sort of has come together in a project that's coming out next year. So memoir pending, novel, I don't know. Give me a few more years, maybe I'll have a novel out.
Fantastic. No, it all sounds great. And I think as well as a creative person, you're kind of led by where that inspiration is drawn from, aren't you? Whether that be writing, whether it be painting or drawing, making crafts, anything like that, you're sort of drawn to what makes your heart sing a little bit. And that changes over time, like we evolve over time.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, that publication opportunities, because there are always certain trends. I often say I was quite lucky, I think, with the journaling books, because there was just this real burgeoning trend just when I was beginning to do my research around journaling. Suddenly it was everywhere and everyone had this different technique or there were these books. So sometimes I think the stars align a bit with, you're a creative person, you're following your passions, if you're anything like me as a creative person, you usually have about 10 different projects going at once or little ideas or things you're tinkering with. And you're just quite lucky, I think, if that aligns with what a publisher is looking for as a writer, because, yeah, it takes a lot of moving parts to align for a book to actually get published. Of course, there's self-publishing and you can always go down that path. But my preference is traditional publishing just because it saves me a lot of work on my own, somebody to
Yes.
collaborate with and help you put your stuff out in the world.
Yeah, they have the links already rather than you starting from scratch. And I know there's platforms
Exactly.
and things that will help. But yeah, and it's interesting what you were saying because I completed a master's. Well, last year I completed it, but I haven't yet had the official results, which I think is the end of this month, start of next month. But the creative writing and well-being, which is actually a Teesside, which is the one that you helped to put together all of those years ago. I know you don't work there anymore. And it's interesting what you were saying about Pennebaker, Progoff, is it? And all of these really seminal people within that field. And the particular module that I loved was the writer and the self, which was about, a lot of those psychology elements and how we get to grips with, the different parts of ourselves and are there really different parts of ourselves? And I thought that was absolutely fascinating because that really does just open up so many more opportunities for us as a creative person. I think we're more open to that as well. And I think over the years, my logical head always has to try and step in and try and keep me safe. And it was nice to be able to think, actually, I can just let these ideas and these different dimensions of myself, just explore that and be able to openly write them on the page, and who knows what will come out. And quite often, there's a piece of really good work at the end of that, whether you decide to do something with it or not. So I think people sometimes underestimate the power of the written word, but it's so valuable.
Yeah, and I think even if you are someone who writes and has written a lot or considers yourself creative, I work one to one with creative writers often, and they'll have an idea for a book that they're trying to publish, and we're kind of working on it together. And it's really remarkable sometimes as an outsider. I feel like it's a great privilege actually to be a mentor and work with others on their creative projects. I love it so much. It really, as you said, it's a real passion for me. It brings me a lot of joy. It's really interesting to watch sometimes people come to sessions with me with an idea that so and so book that they want to write. Yeah, maybe there's a particular publishing trend or they've got some professional thing that they want to write a book about, and then like just below the surface, and because I've worked with writers for so long and I've gone quite deep with myself, my own writing, my own identity and selfhood, just below the surface, there's often something completely different, like a different story that's driving them on. And sometimes our mentoring sessions can get like really emotional because people are diving it almost unwittingly, diving into quite deep stuff when they start writing, and especially if they're working on any kind of life writing. I think it's a really magical process because it can be a scary process too, but you're kind of excavating, I think, and there are very few spaces in most people's lives to do that kind of excavation. There's not usually, you don't go that deep in professional settings. It's not usually appropriate, is it? If you're lucky, you've got some really good friends that you can talk about deep stuff with, but not even all of us have that. Maybe our friendships feel a bit superficial. So I think that's the real unique power of writing, whether it's creatively, which I believe has all of its own interesting factors, or simply in a journal reflectively. It's that chance to just go a bit below the surface. For that particular module, Writing in the Self, I have to shout out Dr. Sophie Nichols, because that was originally her module, because we created some new modules, but we had some existing modules that made up the MA. And she did her PhD with Dr. Celia Hunt at Sussex University, who is a real pioneer. She's like the mother of writing and wellbeing as we know it today, I feel, especially that kind of more process oriented or humanistic or developmental kind of psychological view of it, because Pennebaker, really, really interesting, but a lot of that is quite narrow. I don't want to make it sound like I don't really respect Pennebaker's work, because I think it's so fascinating. It's done so much for the world of writing and wellbeing to kind of legitimize it, but sometimes it can seem quite reductive. So it's like, well, they used words like happy and glad, and then they use words like sad and bad. And it can feel quite simplistic sometimes. And I think what was lovely, particularly about that Writing in the Self module, what's really lovely about the legacy of Dr. Sophie Nichols and Dr. Celia Hunt's work, is that it's a lot more complicated than that. And especially when it comes to creative writing, there is so much in that process, not just of expressing, like get it done on the page, but shaping and honing and adding metaphor and figurative language and doing something else with the work. And maybe, in my case, many writers do this. You revisit a piece of creative writing many times over many years, and a new version of you turns up to the page every time and meets all these old versions. It's infinitely fascinating, I think. So it can be a shame sometimes, I think, to kind of reduce that. And just to speak to your point again, I think even as individuals, we start writing, we don't even know how deep it can go into our own selfhood. That's part of the fun.
Yeah, oh, definitely part of the fun. The way that you talked about going in and digging and excavating is a great metaphor for the depths that we can really reach, the shadow work and that sort of darker side of things. It's funny because for my final assignment, I started writing a novel. Originally, I was going to put different pieces of work together, but I thought, no, I've always wanted to write a novel, so this is part of the reason why I'm here. And got up to the just over 15,000 words, and then the reflective side, the critical reflection. And I'm actually up to about 24,000 words with that, so I have continued it. But it started off as a nice feel good story, a kind of finding yourself. You find yourself, and work is just a disaster, relationships are broken up, that kind of story, and let's go out and find ourselves. But because I love reading crime and psychological thrillers and those kind of books, it was sort of too nicey for me. So I've turned it into a bit of a sinister plot. And I did one of the exercises, because at the moment I'm studying Kay Adams's Journal to the Self to be certified in it. And one of the exercises, which I've done before, but not to this detail, was the 100 list, should I say. And I used the novel for that list. And I was amazed at some of the things that I uncovered, some of the ideas that, now I'm very excited about how to explore this a little bit more. And I feel as though I'm gone slightly off track there with what we were talking about. But
I think that's a really good example of staying open to what kind of comes through when you open the channel. Be that because you're writing a novel, be that because you've opened the pages of a journal. I think that's just a good example of we can often surprise ourselves. And I think that's the magic of it, because there's not always room to surprise ourselves in that way in the strictures of everyday life. So a good example.
Thank you. Yes, and that surprise is a great word there to point out things that of your own writing. What surprises you? Where's that curiosity, and where is that taking you? Because that is a great example, I think, of your your unconscious, your subconscious elements coming up to the surface a little bit more, so your conscious mind can explore them in more detail. And it just takes that little bit of teasing, opening that door, delving a little bit deeper, whatever metaphor works for people, to help that to come up to the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like that you use the word curiosity, because I have a real like, personal relationship with that word. I did what's called the VIA character strengths. So have you done that one?
The VIA, is it American or Canadian?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
sounds familiar. I might
So
have done
it
one of their free
originated.
PDFs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It originated with some research by Martin Seligman, who considered like the father of positive psychology, and some other psychologists. It stands for values in action, and it's just one of my favorite tools to play with within that kind of realm of positive psychology, because it, rather than sort of, what are my weaknesses and how do I fix them, it's looking at what are my natural strengths or my passions, or indeed my values, what really drives me in my life, and how can I do more of that. And it just was quite impactful for me. I remember I did it during my master's study twice, like 6 months apart, and it used to have, anyway, it might have more now, but it used to have 250 questions. So it's quite in depth, out of the 24 character strengths, and then you get them kind of like ranked. And both times my top strength was curiosity, and it was really like a kind of seminal moment for me, because as a creative person, I feel like for a long time, and anyone who's creative, I'm sure, will relate to this in some way. For a long time, I just felt quite flaky. And it's really interesting because people look at my career now and they think like, oh, it all makes sense. You did that, and then that led to that. As I was living the early part of my career, I really felt like I was going all over the place. And it feels in one way like luck that it all just came together. And in another way, like I really was just following my interest and my passion. And I think, that's the only thing you can really do. But when I was able to reframe that kind of flakiness as curiosity, and that inherently being a strength, it really did a lot to sort of bolster my sense of self, bolster my pride in who I am as a creative person, and the value in being curious, because it makes you great at conversation, it makes you great at working with writers, because you can, you're relentlessly asking writers, what were you trying for here, what was the aim, what did you want me to feel, getting curious about yourself when you're writing your own stories. It's a really fulfilling practice, I think, to be, well, I would say that's just my top strength, but I think, it's one that's not valued enough, I don't think. And again, I keep saying this, but there's very little space, I think, as adults in the world, to follow our curiosity. Children are so curious, and they're so encouraged to be curious. You imagine, like, in the garden, and they find a little ladybug or something.
Yeah.
They're brand new, aren't they? So they're so enchanted by the world. It's making me think of Catherine May's book on enchantment. I read that recently.
Yes, me
Um,
too. It's
yeah, and
great.
it's such a lovely read, and I love all of her work. But she talks a lot about it in that book, how we lose that as adults. And I think writing can really be a way to keep it alive, especially when you intentionally include things like curiosity, joy, into that practice, rather than just digging up the tough stuff, even though, that's valuable, of course, too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the curiosity element helps you to just get a little bit underneath that surface level. It really does help us just to, put a little candle to something and lighten it up a little bit more. I think I need to dig mine out for the VIA, but I'm sure that curiosity was one of my top, certainly within the top four, I would
Yeah.
say.
I feel
To
like
be in,
for most creative people, it's got to be up there, hasn't it? Because
it has.
it's the beating heart of creativity, I think, being curious about the world, and wanting to learn, and being interested, and wanting
Yeah.
to go deeper, as you say.
Yeah, my partner's daughter she's almost 10. So I think she's perhaps bordering on that level of no longer being that sort of childlike innocence and excited and curious about everything, to be a little bit more logical and sensible about things. And we did, I mean, I don't know how true some of these are. I do have a few opinions about some YouTube shorts, but we did a little colour exercise at the weekend where we looked at pictures, various things, and then based on the colour, the prominent colour that we thought was within that picture, or within the way that a sentence was formed out of different colours, that led us to being a certain mental age. And my mental age was a lot lower than hers. And I just thought, well, that's really interesting because I certainly within the last year, maybe just over a year, I've really tried to embrace my child, my childlikeness. And yeah, I am forever asking questions on a walk. Oh, I wonder about this, or what about this, or how did that get there? And I'm sure some people think, Anna, will you just be quiet, just enjoy the walk? But there's so many things that grab my attention, and I completely understand where you're coming from with your younger self, how you deemed that to be flaky, but reframing that and having the positive angle is quite empowering.
I think that's another real special aspect of the landscape of writing is that we meet those parts of ourselves again that we lost maybe, and we get to bring them to life whenever we want. And and especially I think that childhood self, again, it's why often in like mentoring or workshops I do with other writers, it can become quite emotional because I often find, so it's kind of a theory, a working theory I've got, that people tend to, for whatever reason, abandon their creative selves at like certain key ages. So it's quite often when people are just coming out of childhood, I've found, not to go to like psychoanalysis with it. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I just see it happen time and again where, maybe someone was 12 or 13 or 14, 15, or maybe a little bit older or whatever. Somebody in their lives, be it a teacher, be it a parent, sort of gave them some kind of lecture, or maybe they got lots of mini lectures about, we're not going to make any money doing that, be sensible, be logical. And I think at that tender age, a lot of us, or for maybe for a long time, right into your 20s, maybe even into your 30s, there is this sort of like almost like pretense of being an adult, like, oh yeah, okay, you're trying to look like a grown up. I feel like a lot of us are. Obviously we're all so different, but get a sensible job, make a living, maybe you get married or settle down with someone, whatever. And along the way, wherever it happened, you left part of you behind. And what I love to do is work with writers, yeah, maybe they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, and they're picking up their creativity again. And I always love to ask questions about that. Where did you leave them behind? When was it? And maybe it wasn't one moment that they can pin down. Maybe it was over a few years. Maybe it was at university or at some point where they kind of abandon that part of themselves. And it can be a real grief to realize that, but it's also a very joyous thing because there's a chance then for a reunion. And sometimes it really is like, what's called inner child work, because sometimes you were really young. Sometimes people were 8 and they wrote a story and they read it out at school and the teacher said, it's not very good, or something. Awful things happen to people with their tender little creative selves early on. It's so tragic. And so then when you imagine you pick that up again, maybe you're in your 50s or something, you're starting to write creatively again. And there's this sort of well that you access that can be filled with sadness, but also filled with joy because it's your 8-year-old that you're meeting again that gave up way back for whatever reason because it wasn't supported. And yeah, I think when you open that well and you can access it and you work with it intentionally, as I was saying, it's such a special, special thing. And it doesn't have to be formally creative writing. I think a lot of creativity comes into journaling as well. So
Yeah, I think you've just, yeah, in a nutshell, explained that loss of creativity into adulthood. And then there always comes a point, I think, in everybody's life, and that is going to be at different ages when we do meet them again. And that's the chance then for us to really explore and bring that back into our lives, which does for sure create more joy. Yeah.
I really think of writing as a relationship. It's like you're relating to yourself. And I think finding ways to spend time with writing, i.e., spend time with a part of yourself, is so important. It's a very integrating thing. So much of life is fragmenting us and making us play different roles, and we're over here and we're over there. So any space where we can sort of draw these parts back and hold
Mm.
them closer to ourselves, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, and being comfortable with that as well. I think a lot of people these days they struggle with just listening to their inner voice, their intuition, their gut, however you want to word that. And there's so much going on externally and so many pressures that come in on us from an external point of view. It's difficult sometimes to sit with the inner whispers because it's so different to what's outside. And I think once we're able to do that, it is a lot more enriching. And I think that's then helps us to sort of just, create our true voice again and feel comfortable once again to actually stand by who we are instead of all of this external noise that we feel as though we should conform to this, or maybe we can't disagree with this person because of, you know, whatever relationship that there is there. But yeah, it's almost like it's once we let that come out, there's just this whole new world, or perhaps the world that, you know, we left behind when we said goodbye at whatever point it was to our creativity, but we're letting that back in, and it's yeah, it's a fabulous time.
I love that description of inner whispers, because I
Mm.
think sometimes it is very quiet. It is a very quiet part of yourself, and for a lot of people, I don't think they can hear. Maybe they can't hear anything. I know. I'm just thinking of my husband, for example. Like I don't think he has the kind of inner monologue that I constantly have going on in my head. For whatever reason, we're all different. But of course, he has emotions and he has feelings, and so sometimes we're having chats, and I'm trying to kind of excavate on his behalf. I'm like, well, what might be going on with that? And he's like drawing a blank. He doesn't know. I think it can be the case for a lot of men, actually, just, you know, because of societally different pressures and different expectations on boys versus girls growing up. Um, but yeah, I think I was also going to say it's a real, I don't want to say a life's work, because I think it's a joy. I think it's a pleasure, but life's work in the sense of hearing those inner whispers, it'll go on forever. Again, I always use this analogy of thinking of it like a relationship. You know, if you have a really dear friend, I've got a great friend. We've been friends for 25 years this year. So we've grown up together. We know each other so well. I never expect her to be the same person 1 year to the next. You know, if she gets a totally new job, or she's in a new relationship, or whatever it is, she's got a new hobby. It's like, cool, yeah, she's growing, she's changing. And I think sometimes we don't give ourselves that grace, but building that trusting, loving, attentive relationship with oneself involves you actually getting to know yourself anew all the
Yeah.
time. And again, I think that's what can be so powerful with the journaling practice specifically, but creative writing, all kinds of writing, is you're acquainting yourself with yourself over and
Mm.
over again, and building. I like to think of it in terms of what the psychologist Carl Rogers called the helping relationship. He talked about, you know, therapists, counselors, teachers as being in this role of a helping relationship, and it having these key kind of facets to it. It's somewhere in Joy of Writing Things Down I talk about it, like unconditional positive regard, he called it, and empathy, and sort of meeting people where they are. I think of writing as a helping relationship with oneself, and just like any other relationship, it doesn't happen by accident. And I don't mean that to say you must journal every day at so whatever time for however long. That relationship can look totally different. You know, none of our friendships are like we meet every day at
Yeah.
this time, you know, and we have to have coffee at this place. There's inherent flexibility to friendship. We meet them where we are, when we can. Maybe it's a quick coffee, maybe we go on a holiday together, or maybe it's just like, you know, going to the cinema once every 6 months or something. All of our friendships and what we have to offer a friendship, it's different. And I think in a journal, it's the same. It's like, how can I meet myself in this season of my life? How much time have I got to be with myself? For me, a lot changes when I think about writing in that way. When I think about it as being with myself, it stops feeling like such a chore or an addition. Not that I personally usually find writing a chore, but I know for a lot of people who think they want to write a book, or they want to keep a journal, or they want to get some kind of fixed writing habit, it very quickly starts to feel like a burden, because they're thinking, I've got to get up at 5 a.m. and I've got to do this many words and it's got to look like this. None of us would expect that we could do that, for example, to a friend. You've got to be at my house at 5 a.m. We've got to spend 2 hours. We have to have a conversation that lasts. Do you see what I mean? So it changes the whole quality of our writing when we think of it as a relationship. Anyway, I could talk about that all day, but I think it there's an energetic difference anyway for me to look at it that way.
Yeah, there is. No, I haven't heard of that before, but it's great. I really like the idea of thinking about your writing and helping to build that relationship up with yourself like a friendship. And as you were talking, I was thinking about one of my friends who I've known since we were 5 years old, and you know, we've sort of gone different ways. We've come back together. We've gone other separate ways, and as you say, getting married and having children, and you know, all these sort of big milestone events that come in. But there's still an element of us still as children there. But yeah, we kind of get to know each other in different ways every time something happens. Yeah, we never have the same, you know, sometimes we can go months without speaking to each other, and then we'll have an afternoon tea somewhere and spend half a day together, and it's like we've never been apart for so long. And journaling or creative writing, it's exactly the same. It's there when you need it, and there's no expectations. It's just there as a friend, a non-judgmental entity, waiting, listening. And I say waiting and listening, and even though you look at the blank page, there's nothing on there, but it does still help to tease things out. There's still that element of interaction, and there's techniques like dialoguing that can help with that, of course. But it does have a almost hypnotic state, I think, of helping to bring things out, magnify the things that need to be magnified at that time, and create meaning at that time. And you've mentioned different metaphors, throughout the conversation so far, which I think is a great way for us to be able to tap into what is really important now, or to look out for in the future.
I think you'll always get me using metaphors, analogies. It's that curiosity thing. It's just how I understand the world. Like, what is that similar to? What's that like? What does that feel like? And trying to actually really articulate for myself what something's like. And again, that's such a big part of what we're doing in a writing practice is saying, what's this like? What's it like being a human being, and trying to explore that for ourselves. Yeah. And I think it's a real joyous thing. It's a great gift to have in life. I think it's real, as you say, like writing is there when we need it. It's there for us, and it's something whenever I do podcasts or anything like this, I really try and advocate for, because there is so much out there that's like, this is the hack, or this is the 10 steps to XYZ result. There was recently this kind of thing going around on Instagram of this woman who's like 100 and something, and she's journaled every day. Did you see this? She's journaled every day of her
Not
whole
seen
life.
that.
It's really beautiful. Like, what a lovely thing to celebrate. But I also then think people look at stuff like that and they think, oh, well, I haven't journaled every day of my life, so why should I bother? But applying this thing of looking at it like a relationship, like you say, that has different seasons. And, I don't journal every day. My whole life is around journaling as a practice. I don't think it's something I need to do every day. There have certainly been seasons of my life where I did it every day. But just like we were saying with a friendship, my friends who I see once every couple of years because they live in different countries are no less valuable to me, and our relationship is no less important because we're not together every day. It'd be lovely if we were together every day, but I think looking at writing as something that stretches around you and your needs, and having, I guess, the confidence to lean into whatever aspect of writing is working for you, because you were describing in a really lovely way there that what happens for you with the blank page. And I was agreeing, because I feel that too with the blank page. But I also know, because I've taught writing a lot, that the blank page is really intimidating for some people. And it doesn't have that effect at all. And it could be quite terrifying to listen to those inner whispers, as you called them, or to think that we've got anything to say at all of any import, and our stuff comes up. The page, it's a bit of a worn out cliche, but the page is like a mirror. Like, it will show us what's there. And if what's there is we worry that we're good enough, that's what we're going to see back. So I think whatever writing technique, tool, Bible, guide you're following, and just thinking of whoever's listening, like, make sure it's something that's giving you confidence to make writing work for you. As soon as again, because it starts to feel then like that chore, that burden. If you start to think, oh, I have to follow this process exactly, if that works and that's generating meaningful dialogue within yourself, that process or whatever is great. But just make sure you're tuned into that, and you're not just doing it because it's the 10-step process or whatever. Because I think the real bliss, if you like, the real value of a writing practice is that sincerity. And if you're just trying to fit into a cookie cutter, I mean, but so much of life is that, isn't it? We're all looking for kind of blueprints to follow, because it's quite scary being a human. And
you're absolutely right. I think the blueprint, we're trying to find something. It's almost trying to find something or someone to say, okay, here is your perfect life, and this is the steps from 1 to 10, or however many that be, for you to get there. Just follow this and everything will happen. But then we're sort of following somebody else's process. And I think it's great to have some steps that we can try, see what works for us, but then reflect on how that's working. But equally, coming back to what you were saying about getting to know ourselves, these are all techniques that we can try that just help us to get to know ourselves. And we don't need to use somebody else's complete steps, or for somebody else to tell us what to do, because actually we know what to do. We've just hidden a lot of it. And the creative writing, or whatever we choose for our well-being, is a practice that helps us to let that shine again. And we just need to, trust ourselves and trust, I'm going to say process here, but the process in, that we know what's best for us
Yeah.
almost. And it's trying those different techniques and those different ways to find out the one that works for us, and then trusting that's you that's talking. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody else to tell you what to do. But I think that's where, like yourself, Megan, being a book mentor, a writing mentor, somebody that helps to ask those questions and helps people to get curious about what is it that works for them. And then when that surfaces, encouraging them and helping them to keep that up as a practice when they need to.
I mean, it's so much about trust. I think that's probably where the analogy I was sort of extending there about it being like a friendship. A trusting friendship isn't built overnight, is it? We
Mm.
don't expect to kind of, I don't know, meet someone at yoga class and then you're suddenly best friends. Like sometimes you have an immediate spark with someone and it's really great, but you wouldn't then, give them your house keys when you go on holiday. You know what I mean? Trust takes time. And I think when people are meeting themselves on the page, that trusting relationship will also take time, and it will take going through some stuff together. So I think I can hear when you're talking about writing, obviously you're quite seasoned, if you like, and I feel the same. It's something that's come very naturally to you and you've done it often, but I'm thinking of those people for whom it feels a bit awkward and scary at first. So I would say, if it's not that you instantly feel this trusting, safe relationship with yourself on the page, cool, that makes sense, because it's like a new thing that you're doing, just like any new friendship. And so much of, my influence, or, how I theorize writing, comes from humanistic psychology, and particularly Carl Rogers, and that idea that life is a process. It's not a rigid set of ABC steps that if you follow, everything will be fine. And his belief was that the more rigid the psyche is, the more rigid an individual is in how they see the world and how they see things, the more we tend to suffer, because we all know, don't we, that best laid plans and then things go wrong. Someone gets ill, or we lose our job, or we lose someone for whatever reason, things don't look the way that we hoped that they would. Then what? Um, so I think practicing that process oriented way of being, and being, as you said, trust, I think is so key. Trust in ourselves to navigate that. I think
Mm.
writing is just one big practice for for life, for meeting the things that happen in our lives, and knowing that we can shape, when it comes to creative writing, that we can shape them into something meaningful that might be helpful or insightful for others. I think that's a lovely part of it as well, when you're going through something tough as a writer. In the back of your mind, you just think, well, at least I could tell a good story about this.
Yeah. And I think, creative writers, they see a story in a lot of things, but that does take practice sometimes. But yeah, you mentioned about me being seasoned. I have written off and on throughout my life, and I was one of those children staying in the classroom at lunchtime and break times and writing stories. But then, yeah, I lost that from about the age of 11 and probably didn't pick it up again really until later adulthood, even though I've dream journaled quite a lot off and on throughout most of my life. And that, I think, was my way of keeping the fiction novel aspiration alive, even though I at the time probably didn't know that was what I was doing, because I hadn't got that relationship with me, and I wasn't listening to those inner whispers, even though they were trying to come out in the dreams. I wasn't really paying much attention to them. So it's only really the last maybe 4 or 5 years since I had a bit of a milestone change in my life, is that I've started to focus more on writing. And I think, for whatever creative path people take to sort of find themselves and build that relationship with themselves, it's not always going to be, okay, at such and such a time, this is when it's going to be reintroduced or introduced to me. Things do just happen that are unexpected, and then it leads us down a different path. But I think certainly since I've started being more open and curious about things, anything that sort of knocked me off track a little bit doesn't bother me in half as much of the way that it used to do when I was more rigid. You were saying more rigid about things. So I think just being curious in general, whether you turn that into a writing practice or something else, helps you to navigate life a lot better.
And I mean, when I say seasoned, I didn't mean to imply, maybe you've been doing it day in, day out for your whole life. I would say, that little version of you that was doing it in the break times, and that it was just springing up very naturally, like a little seedling that was just there with you from the beginning. that's what I mean by seasons, that you
Mm.
arrived with it, it was there, and all of us get taken off track, don't we, to whatever life throws us. We have to grow up and be sensible and get jobs and whatever. But yeah, if it was there, if the impetus was there when you were young, it's always there. It's just sort of
Yeah.
fallow, if you like, just there behind. And when you get the chance to water it, then it's just ready to bloom, which is what I find so exciting about working with writers, especially when they're in later life and they're coming back to it. I think like I said, it can sometimes come with quite a lot of grief because people realize, there was wasted time that they weren't, with that
Yeah.
part of themselves. So it can come with sadness, but it's also such a joyful reunion, as I said, when people find that bit of themselves again and give it, as you said, give it openness and space and
Mm.
curiosity and ask questions of it. It's lovely to see when you see it happening with someone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the analogy of watering the seed and it helping to grow. And I, in particular, do get a lot of inspiration from going outside. That expansiveness of being outside helps me to grow. And I think one of the things I was going to ask you, Megan, just because the outdoors does really, it helps to nurture my writing, is what does nature, what role does nature play in your life? Is it just for you individually or as part of your creative or your writing process?
A huge role. I think I feel most myself in natural spaces in a kind of pragmatic way. I love walking to just sort of start my ideas going. Again, Catherine May writes really beautifully about that in that Enchanted book, or Enchantment, I think it's called, isn't it? She really describes this kind of like the first 20 minutes, she's got her kind of busy mind and it's still chattering away. The second 20 minutes, she gets a bit more zen, a bit more meditative, she's in the moment. And that final 20 minutes, it's like the ideas start coming through, the
Yeah.
channel starts opening. And when I read that, I really related to it. I was like, yeah, that's suddenly I get all these ideas. I can't wait to get home and like start doing my creative practice. So walking is a big one for me. But also, I mentioned I've got this a memoir that I've been writing that's going to come out next year. And the premise of that is, or the structure, I should say, is wild swimming. And I know wild
Ah,
swimming, again, this is what I was talking about, sort of trends in the publishing industry, kind of mapping onto your own experience. Because I had never really thought of myself as like a wild swimmer, because it seems quite an official thing that you have to be right now, like cold water swimming and quite extreme stuff. And yet, as it started to become more and more trendy, I thought I have always swam in wild spaces and I've always been so compelled to wild water in different versions, sometimes just being beside it, not just being in it, but um, really going out of my way to swim in the sea, to swim in rivers, to swim in lagoons and pools. I was really lucky. I lived for a few years in Spain, in Catalonia, and they have wonderful mountains there and lots of lovely like pools that you can swim in. Um, so yeah, that story is all about places I've swum in the world and using that as a kind of framework to navigate some complex trauma that I had and healing from difficult things that happen and the healing power of water and just wild landscapes in general. A little extract of the longer work was something I submitted for do you know Laurie Lee? If you're
so.
from the kind of West Country, I grew up in Bristol, you know him because we all had to look at him at school because he's kind of like the Shakespeare of the West Country, if you like. He wrote a famous memoir called Cider with Rosie that was published in his writing is very much about how we as human beings relate to and kind of become ourselves in the natural world. And his writing is so, so beautiful. Anyway, I was really lucky to be shortlisted for this Laurie Lee Prize at the end of last year. I didn't win, but I did get highly commended, and it was really encouraging, to keep
Congratulations.
going with this project that now is going to be published. But I can't remember where I was going with that. Beyond saying that using writing to narrate for yourself this process of becoming yourself in wild
Yeah.
spaces is a really beautiful thing, I think. And Laurie Lee's, if you're interested in that, I would really recommend Laurie Lee's writing.
Yeah, I've written it down.
And yeah, for me, that memoir of almost again, this is what I was saying just a little while ago about the power of things happening to you and then writing about them creatively and finding metaphors and a kind of container for what happened in a way that helps you make sense of it is incredibly powerful. It's almost tricky for me to put into words how magical it has been of an experience to be drafting this story that takes quite a huge chunk of my pretty much my whole life because some of it's from really early life using this metaphor of swimming, grief, healing, wild spaces, finding ourselves sort of hitting up against the elements of the natural world as part of becoming who we are. Yeah, been really formative, powerful experience for me. So yeah, nature and how that makes its way into the themes of my writing practice, as well as how I was saying on a walk or whatever, it generates the mood for writing. I couldn't overstate how big a part of my practice it is actually. Yeah.
Yeah, because the weather can really mirror how we're feeling inside. The sunshine, a thunderstorm, a drizzly, rainy, grey day, all those are metaphors for our emotions, for our moods. And I think the wild swimming, I've tried wild swimming last year, just at a local organised lake, although I do like going in the sea when it's not too cold, I have to say. But I feel very comfortable in water, and the science out there is amazing for how good it is for mental health. All you need is a couple of minutes to help you feel much better. But there's so much with the elements, the earth, the air, the water, the sun, we really can take in, because we were born from nature and we lived in nature for so long. Only for a short period of time have we lived how we live in modern society. So it makes perfect sense for us to feel so at home when we're in nature in some
Yeah,
way.
we're very fractured in modern life from how things have been. Um, I always remember I volunteered for this really amazing program called the Happiness Project in Bristol, that was sort of a combination of arts practice and positive psychology. And it was just when I was doing my master's. It was a really cool thing. And it was these free to access kind of wellbeing workshops that really inspired a lot of what I've gone on to do. I remember one of the facilitators leading that, and we were in quite a large room. So if you imagine like a big classroom, like a school, but that kind of size room. And I remember her saying, if you imagine the width of this room, I'm trying to think how many meters it'd be, but maybe like 6 meters, seven
Yeah.
meters wide, a big, big room. She said, if you imagine the width of this room is all of human history, she held up a piece of paper, thin piece of A4 paper. She said, the width of this piece of paper is how long we've lived inside, in built
Wow.
environments. And it really stayed with me. It really struck me. And I think of it
Yeah.
often because I love being outdoors. And yet I still, just in a typical week, find myself stuck indoors a lot,
Mm.
just because work commitments or, as you were saying, the weather. We live in rainy UK. It's been very dark because we've just been through the winter. So it's, you finish work at 5 and then it's dark already and maybe you don't feel safe going out, or, it's just not so
Mm.
inviting. So even as somebody who really wants to get outside and has the best intentions, I don't find that I always am. And yet it's so where we're kind of meant to be in so many
Yeah.
ways. So yeah.
Yeah, we might not feel like going outside, but once we go outside, we feel a lot better afterwards.
Yeah.
The Happiness Project, was that something to do with Gretchen Rubin?
No, so there is another, I think you're thinking of Action for Happiness. There's another organization that also started in Bristol. Or maybe Gretchen Rubin did have a book called The Happiness
I think
Project.
she had a book called that. I've got one of her books. I was trying to just have a look to see what the title of it was. Oh, Live Life in the Five Senses. But before that, I'm sure she did something to do with the Happiness Project, but I might
I
have a
think
slight
it
a
it
word
yeah, no,
out
it could be
there.
exact same title. This was like a kind of it was funded. They got some funding from the Big Lottery. They were kind of social entrepreneurs.
Mm,
None of them were writers or anything. They were artists, but they were applying a lot of that kind of post-psych theory. So I think they sort of like, but just borrowed that title for it. But it was a whole series
yeah.
of workshops on character strengths, on nature, and they just did another project more recently. I can't remember the exact title of that, but it was all about essentially like forest bathing and going into
Mm,
natural spaces and the well-being effects of that. So um, yeah, the organization is called Lightbox, if anyone's
mm.
interested. Like, if you Googled Lightbox Bristol. But yeah, that was years ago, that initial project. But it was, again, another. It's always interesting coming on these things and chatting about yourself. You realise that was so formative for me, just that
Yeah.
coincidence that was going on. I mean, I'm lucky to be from Bristol because these kind of things do happen in Bristol. It's a very like cool liberal city. But yeah, that was right on my doorstep, and I was able to volunteer as a young woman and then think I'd like to
Yeah.
support people with their well-being and their creativity, and then that's what I went on to do. So yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing what stays with us, isn't it, over time? I went down to Bristol not long ago for the Natural Academy. They are down there and they do a lot of ecotherapy and psychotherapy training with outside, and they do a lot of work with the NHS and clinical organisations for nature-based practices and how that helps with with well-being. It's not so much writing, it's more about just being in nature and, making things nature and using parts of nature to then craft something. But it all sort of ends in the same way, I think, for it's just to feel more fulfilled in life and to gain more out of life. So I mean, we've talked about loads this morning. I could keep asking you questions and talking to you, but I'm very conscious of time. So you've mentioned that your book next year, we're recording this early 2025, so it'll be 2026. So I shall be certainly tapping you up to find out the exact date for that. But you've got your main Megan C. Hayes website. You've also got your Positive Journal website, and then there's your Joyful School of Writing, where you've got an abundance of different resources that people can tap into different techniques for writing. You've got on-demand materials, you've got ways to work with you in a group or sort of one-to-one mentoring. So what's next for you in 2025, and how, I suppose, for people that are new to writing, where would you navigate them to first and connect with you in what way?
It's so interesting because I think people come to writing from so many different avenues, and I'm always wary of emphasizing the stuff I do with creative writing and almost like alienating journalists, or like angling my stuff towards journalists and then alienating creative writing. I think the best place if people are interested in my work to start would be meganchayes.com, or I'm also on Instagram at megan.c.hayes to just get a flavor of my vibe. But Joyful School has, yeah, as you were saying, a lot of on-demand stuff. There's a free set of tools that you can download that somewhat angle towards people with a creative practice, but it also is applicable if you want to create any kind of writing practice. So if you're someone who's just writing reflectively in a journal, it's still, I think, got some value. I tend to find that most people, even if they don't feel ready to admit it to themselves, are creatively inclined, even if they're just keeping a journal because that feels accessible to them right now. So I would say don't be afraid if there's something that sparked your interest in us talking about more creative ways of writing. So yeah, downloading those free tools would be a cool thing. If you're already like maybe quite seasoned as a journaler or working with others, then I would say go to positivejournal.org. I've got a training there that's an on-demand training for facilitators. Currently it's just self-study, but I originally ran it live, and I might run a live version again, but at the moment it's just sort of there for people to do in their own time. And yeah, if you're really not sure what kind of writer you are, what kind of writer you want to be, but you've just been intrigued about some themes that we've talked about today, I do offer one-to-one work. So it could be just we get together, have a one-to-one session and talk about, are you a journaler? Are you a creative writer? Do you want to write a memoir? So yeah, people can get in touch with me. I'm so open to hearing from anyone wherever they are on their journey with writing. As I've been saying all along, I just love writers. I adore people who put their experience into words and, as we were saying, are curious and open enough to listen to that inner whisper, to borrow your phrase, if that's all right. Because I think it's such an exciting thing, and I love to sort of hold someone's hand through that, whatever that looks like, whether that's a workshop, whether it's someone reads one of my books. All the books are on Megan C. Hayes. If you go to meganchayes.com/books, Joy of Writing Things Down is there, Write Yourself Happy is there. I think if you like words, there'll be something in my work that will inspire you. So
yeah, just from talking to you on this podcast and listening to you at the Barcelona Journaling Festival, and then listening to the book, you're very enthusiastic, and that kind of comes across, and you can't help but either smile, when you're looking at you or listening to you. That's very infectious. So people have got a little inkling of wanting to learn more, do more with their creativity, help to blast out their curiosity, then encourage them to connect with you and find out more. So thank you so much for your time. I've got other questions that I would have loved to have asked you, but maybe
we'll have to do a follow-up. We'll have to do a part 2 one day.
Exactly. When your book is ready for next year, we can arrange another one. That would be amazing. But yeah, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure's all mine. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to today's Writing with Purpose podcast. Having conversations with fellow writers or adventure enthusiasts brings two of my biggest loves in life together: writing and nature connection. I've been a copywriter and content creator for 23 years, but my passion is writing for well-being and I'm on a mission to share the benefits that putting pen to paper has for personal wellness with as many people as possible. If you want to learn more about writing for your well-being and journaling techniques, please connect with me in my Facebook group, Journaling with Anna.